Good morning, everyone. Today we continue our analysis of the tragic dumpster fire that was the League of Nations, looking at how its inadequacies eventually led to the catastrophe we know as the Second World War. Today's topic is the Manchurian Crisis, also known as the Manchurian Incident. What was it? It was an illegal Japanese invasion of the territory of Manchuria, which, to the surprise of exactly no one, went completely unpunished by the League of Nations, the institution that was supposed to keep an eye on exactly that sort of things, in order to prevent them from escalating into larger conflicts. In particular, we'll look at the following points. First, what was Imperial Japan? What was Manchuria? What was the incident? What was the reaction? And what were the consequences of the whole incident? There is also a model answer. So, the first three parts will be relatively short and will provide a historical summary of what was going on to answer the question of the day, which is the Manchurian Crisis reinforced the League of Nations. How far do you agree with this statement? To answer this question, you will generally have to focus on the last two parts, the reaction and the consequences. There are also some online resources in the transcript. Now, let's start talking about Imperial Japan. Life in Japan had been pretty chill throughout the early modern period. Sort of. In the 17th century, while Europeans were at each other's throats for all sorts of reasons, the Japanese Empire closed down its country to any kind of outside influence or trade, and the Japanese lived happily ever after in seclusion. Except that they didn't. The age of happy Japanese seclusion came to an abrupt end on July 8, 1853, when a number of American gunships armed to the teeth with all the latest military technology knocked at Japan's door and asked to let the traders in. Or else they would just bomb the country into submission. Now, the Japanese complied and learned a valuable lesson. While they were enjoying the splendid isolation, the world, especially Europe and America, had a gigantic leap forward in terms of technology, known as the Industrial Revolution. And then Japan had to adapt or perish. The government decided to westernize, that is, to imitate all the structures and ideas of Western governments, especially when it comes to the most important things for a state, which are taxes, armies, industries, and war. So, while maintaining a strong Japanese cultural identity, which is still very important to this day, think of animes, they tried to change to fit what was seen as the new model of the Western state. So this is one of history's most fascinating experiments of modernization and transition from a primitive economy to a fully industrialized, fully centralized modern state. And you are encouraged to do your own research about it because, again, it's very interesting. I have added a link in the transcript and will add one in the description as well, hopefully. Now, eventually, this gigantic social effort paid off. In 1905, they were able to defeat a comically unprepared Russian fleet at the Battle of Tsushima, and they became the first Asian country to ever defeat a European power at its own game, modern war. When I say comically unprepared, it's not an overstatement. The Russian fleet in 1905 was really ridiculous, and if you read the diaries of the commander, he was just desperate. He knew he had no chance, but that's another subject. Again, it's interesting, look it up. But still, it was a very important symbolic victory. A non-European nation, after a century and a half of absolute dominance of European powers in terms of war, was able to defeat a European fleet. Incredible. They also started seeing themselves and showing themselves as the defenders of Asians, in quotes, against the Western invaders, something that they would use a lot during World War II to justify the conquests around the Pacific coast. So, what happened in Manchuria? In 1929, the world went through a huge economic crisis, okay, the biggest one before the one we're currently living right now. We don't know if this one is going to be as big, probably. Now, all countries were affected, and Japan was too, because it now had a modern, connected industrial economy. And this means that due to the crisis, Japan lacked the money to feed its growing population and was therefore forced to find the resources to carry on. One of the options they considered was invading China. The country at the time was incredibly weak. We have this idea of China as this global power. It's relatively recent in modern history. China used to be an incredibly important power in ancient, medieval and early modern times. Then for a while it went into an absolute crisis, and now it's re-emerging again as one of the world's most important powers. But at the time, in 1929, in 1930, it was a mess. China was incredibly weak. It did not have a strong government that could react properly to any form of invasion. It was divided by warlords, and most importantly for the Japanese, it also had large plains that could be used to grow the crops needed to feed the growing Japanese population. Well, the Japanese government in Tokyo decided against this option. The Japanese army in Korea, because yes, Japan had also invaded Korea in 1910, the Japanese army was practically independent. They could do whatever they wanted, because what are you going to do? Send an army? No, we are the army. So they refused to obey the orders sent by the central government. They decided instead to go ahead with the invasion of Manchuria, which is a region to the northeast of China, which also has a very interesting history, but I assume my definition of what is interesting in history is not yours. So, moving on. Let's move on to 1931. The Japanese army in Korea decided to stage an incident, and that would justify their invasion. Some Japanese officers, were sent to Manchuria, allegedly, still a bit iffy, were sent to Manchuria to blow up a Japanese railways. The Chinese government or Chinese rebels would be accused of this act, and therefore they would give a justification for the invasion of Manchuria. We were building this railroad and the Chinese blew it up. We better grab all the land. That was more or less what went on. The Japanese army immediately destroyed all Chinese resistance in the area, and by 1934 all that region, which is still as big as France and Germany combined, became known as the state of Manchukuo, a puppet state which was theoretically independent and ruled by a Chinese emperor, but really under the control of the Japanese army. It was a puppet state. Now, the Republic of China decided to appeal to the League of Nations, because that's what you do. Both China and Japan were members, and the Japanese invasion was clearly an illegal land grab. The League of Nations, however, was not a police force. The only thing they could do was to start an investigation to determine whether or not Japan had actually gone against international law by invading Manchuria. The investigation, led by an English diplomat, showed that Japan was guilty. The Assembly of the League of Nations voted unanimously, meaning everybody voted the same thing, voted unanimously to condemn Japan and forced it to withdraw its troops from Manchuria. I'll give you 3 seconds to think whether Japan complied or not. To the surprise of exactly no one, Japan refused to comply, because the League of Nations could not send an army. They could not force Japan to comply. However, they didn't just refuse to obey the instructions of the League of Nations, but they also accused the Western powers, who for a long time had been taking advantage of China's weakness, just as Japan did. They accused the Western powers of hypocrisy. After all, the League was in the hands of France and Britain, which had spent the previous 2 centuries carving up empires in Asia, Africa, and the Pacific. So, the representatives of Japan decided to just leave the League of Nations, making it even weaker, weakening it even further. Now, other than exposing the weakness of its ideological foundation of an organization which was meant to ensure world peace and make sure that no country became bigger by conquering other countries, but at the same time was presided by two countries, Britain and France, who had done just exactly that, So, other than exposing this ideological paradox at the basis of the League of Nations, the incident also had two major consequences for the League. It made it even clearer that without the United States and the Soviet Union, the USA and the USSR, nothing important could be achieved. And it also encouraged other countries, namely Italy and Germany, to pursue aggressive policies, because they knew there would be no retribution, there would be no punishment. First of all, no one in the League could actually do anything to pressure Japan into compliance. However, the Soviet Union, the USSR, bordered Manchuria, and would soon be dragged into an undeclared war against Japan in those exact areas in 1932. If they were part of the League, the presence and the threat of a Russian military action would have granted some credibility to the actions of the League. Instead of saying, withdraw your troops or else, they could have said, withdraw your troops or Russia will invade, which was a credible threat. It was not credible because Russia was not in the League of Nations. The other major power in the area, the United States, which are also a power in the Pacific Ocean at the time, they controlled the Philippines, they controlled and still do several islands in the Pacific. The United States, as we all know, were also not part of the League. While the League itself had promised to enact economic sanctions against Japan, which were never put into practice because the economic crisis of 1929 had sort of made them impossible. But still, if the United States had also joined into giving economic sanctions against Japan, this would have made the threat much more realistic. It might have possibly persuaded Japan, combined with the promise of military pressure from the Soviet Union. It could have possibly have persuaded Japan to come to terms with the League and find a diplomatic solution for Manchuria. Finally, Japan now joined a growing club of powerful countries, which saw the League of Nations as an ineffective club ran by two decayed colonial powers. Fascist Italy, for example, was part of the League and was part of the Permanent Council, but begrudgingly. The fascist government of Italy was against the League of Nations, was a very nationalist government, was a fascist government after all. They wanted to create a colonial empire in Africa, and so the lack of any sort of reaction to the invasion of Manchuria as an incentive to pursue this aggressive policy. They didn't act for Japan, we might as well attack Ethiopia. And this is exactly what they did in 1936. We'll see that, I think, this week or earlier on next week. And the invasion of Ethiopia, as we will see, was another nail in the League's coffin. Nazi Germany, the other outlier in this group, the other great power that was not in the League of Nations, was also not a member, but they also wanted to expand their territory into Central Europe. Like the Japanese, their official objective was the creation of a living space, in quotes, able to feed the growing German population. To get this living space, the political program of the Nazi Party required the invasion of several territories in Central Europe. They saw that the aggressive behavior of Japan was not punished in any concrete way. And they realized that they could get away with it. They could get away with illegal expansion if they wanted to, and they wanted to. They annexed Austria and part of Czechoslovakia in 1936, and nothing happened. They would promise not to do anything in 1938 at the Munich conference, which we will study later on this term, or possibly next term. Still, at the Munich conference, they promised not to grab any more land, but in 1939, they invaded Poland, thus officially beginning World War II. So we can see that there is a connection between the lack of a punishment, the lack of a retribution for the Japanese in Manchuria, and the escalation of tension that eventually led to World War II. So, those were the facts. Now read the model answer and write your own. I am looking forward to read what you can write. See you next time.